Hi everyone! In this video, we'll cover what APIs are, and I'll explain a little bit what APIs are, why do we need them, how do we search them, how do we use them a little bit. And this video is a little bit theoretical, doesn't have any exercises, but so I really hope that you'll stay and listen till the end. And yeah, that's the topics that we'll cover today are what is an API, and we'll discuss about differences about APIs. There are public and private APIs. I will show you some examples of APIs, and also we will be searching and reading API documents together in this video, so you will have clear understanding what API is and how even to read it or how to approach it. Of course, we'll talk a little bit about how to use an API. We will not actually use an API in this video. We'll use this in the future video when we do actual API requests using JavaScript. So let's begin with the first question. What is an API? You probably heard this term from time to time. It's very common to hear this amongst developers. If you ever work with developer, or even if you're just heard some conversation on Reddit online, API is a very common term here. So API stands for Application Programming Interface. At first, it sounds a little bit intimidating, something not clear. So Application Programming Interface. What does it mean? It means basically you as a user, when you interact with the application, you tend to use buttons and text fields and maybe use your keyboard and mouse to interact with the application. You press buttons and you open screens, you close screens, you move sliders. And this is what we called a GUI, a graphical user interface. An API is a different kind of interface. It's an application programming interface. And it's meant less for users and more for other systems and programs to interact with an application. And API allows you to define how can other applications or other systems can use your application, or the other way around. When you want to use some external application, you might want to read its API to understand how can you interact with it. And this is basically how it looks like, but it's very basic and broad picture. So your application here on the left. And if you want to interact, you want to receive some information from this application, you want to read something, you want to write something. And this application can be anything. It can be maybe a weather provider. Maybe it can be even GitHub or any other applications that you know. Maybe it's Facebook. And when you want to interact with it, you usually interact with some sort of layer, which is part of the application, but this is something that is specifically built for other users. It is specifically built for an API so you can use the API to interact with the application. And this is actually important, and it makes things a lot easier for everyone, because sometimes you don't want to directly access to other application. The other application can be written in a different language that you don't know, or maybe the other application like Facebook, they don't want everyone to just interact with them and gain access to the data. They want some sort of protective layer, some API that it will enforce and check that the user is allowed to do this action. And this is very common. That's a common usage of API. And so the API, it defines a few things. It defines what you can and cannot do with the applications. Sometimes you don't want to other external users to do everything. Like Facebook will not allow you to delete users. It doesn't make any sense. Even if you're a developer, you're developing an app that uses Facebook API. And the API also defines how to use it, which kind of data format. Is it a picture? Is it a binary data? What should you expect to get in response? What kind of formats do we support? And also it defines who can interact with it and who has access to the application. Um, and of course, it just defines a set of rules on how to use this application and how to not use it, how should you use it, what should you expect to receive when you ask for data for this, and maybe a list of error messages, maybe some other rules like you can only do 10 requests a day, you cannot ask too many questions. And this is also not just for JavaScript. This is some term that is really general for the programming world. So okay, an API can be written in any language. It can be used in various of things. It doesn't have to be online only. And we'll see some examples right away on real world APIs. And I hope that this will make your picture a little bit more clearer, because now it is all very theoretical. So I want to start with an example from the real world about going to the bank. So imagine that you're going to the bank, and with the bank you can do a bunch of operations. There are things that you can do, like for example, you can ask how much money do I have in my account. And this is interesting because when you go to the bank and ask this question, you'll probably be asked to show some identification, some password or ID card, because they do want to know who you are to give you the correct information. And you can also ask to withdraw some cash from the bank. You can, for example, transfer money from another person. And here you have to specify who is this other person. And this other person must be, of course, a real person with a real bank account. Also, what you can do is you can change your address. That is perfectly fine. If you moved an apartment or a place, you can definitely change your address. And this is sort of like API. When you go to a bank, you know that there are some actions that you can do, that there are some actions that you cannot do, and for every action you can maybe expect what is the result can be. For example, if you want to if you're asking how much money do I have in my account, you should probably expect to receive a number as an answer, and answer as like blue or green is probably not something that you will expect to receive as an answer from the bank teller that you'll be talking to. And of course, there are some actions that there just doesn't make any sense to ask in a bank. They are wrong. For example, if you go to a bank and ask for a double cheeseburger and large fries, the bank teller will probably just look at you and say, you're in the wrong place. You cannot order food here. So this is invalid action. Also, if you're asking, so please add 100,000 euros to my savings account, just like that, it is related to a finance as a bank, but they will not do this because that's not how banks work. They will not just give you free money. Also, you can ask the bank how much money does Danny have in his account, which is a valid question, and the bank will understand it. But you are not allowed to see others' account numbers, and you're not allowed to see how much Danny has money in his account. Well, assuming that you don't have any joint account or something. So this is something sort of like permission problem. They know how much money. They'll just won't tell you because you're not allowed to do that. Also, you can ask, I would like to transfer some money to my cat. So transferring money is something that is valid and you can do, but a cat probably doesn't have a bank account, so you're not allowed to do that because the parameters of this request, the context is incomplete. You're missing some information. And the last one is if you come to the bank and talk Chinese, and if you're not in China, so they will not understand you. Although this last question is actually Google Translate from the first question, How much money do I have in my account? So this question is actually a valid question. And if the bank was in China, it will probably, assuming that the Google Translate did a good job here, they will understand this question. But if you're not in China, they'll just not understand. So you need to know which language also you can speak. You're allowed to speak. You need to know which language the bank understands. So this goes the same for APIs, for programming language. You need to know what to send. You need to know what you can do, what you cannot do. And we'll see a little bit further how can we check this. But before that, a few words about private and public APIs. So there are two types mainly of APIs. Public APIs are available for everyone to use. So anyone with an internet and a will to do that, you can just make a request. They're publicly available. You can get information about some sorts of things, and it's for everyone to use. Some APIs are free, really free, and some of them requires money. For example, if you want to use Google Maps API, you want to use the API to maybe translate zip code to address, or maybe search for address and get the GPS coordinates. Google Maps offers a free service, but after a few requests, you have to pay money in order to do this. And yeah, so some APIs are free. For some APIs, you have to pay money for these services. There are also private APIs. Private APIs are not available for the general public. They're usually inside of a company. So if I'm a developer and I write some JavaScript application that needs to access to my company servers, they might have an API for that. But this API will be private. It will be available only for this company, and no one else will have access to it because maybe it's an internal application. Or maybe it's some sort of special action that no one else outside the company can do. For example, maybe deleting Facebook accounts, or maybe, I don't know, changing some email addresses of all the organization. So those kinds of things can be accessible only within the company. It is quite common to see private APIs when you work in a company. You can check them out, and they're usually meant, of course, for the internal organization, and doesn't make sense to use them externally. Here, of course, we'll use some public APIs to interact with JavaScript. And let's check some examples of those APIs. Here are a bunch of APIs that we can check already. The first one is GitHub. As you all know, you can actually use the GitHub API to get some information about repositories and users. And you can even, if I recall correctly, you can even submit pull requests using APIs. You can read pull requests. You can do a lot of things with the GitHub API, and it's a very, very powerful tool. We also have the Open Weather Map API to get a weather information. So I can query this API and request from it to receive a weather information about current weather, which is cool. And Spotify has also an API. In Spotify, you can search for artists. So I can search for artists, for example, the Beatles, and I can get all the albums as a response, and also all the songs. So maybe if I build some music application, it can be very useful and very nice to use the Spotify API. And in fact, you have been already using some APIs. You just don't know it. So JavaScript DOM, as you used in previous modules, it is actually an API. So when you interact with the button, when you do document get element by ID, when you use the add listener, or when you change the style using JavaScript, you are using the DOM API. And we'll also check this out. So the APIs don't have to be online. You don't have to go query or something. It can be also some services that are available for you. For example, the JavaScript DOM API is a set of functions and that you can use to get information about the current HTML page and modify it, which is super cool. Now let's check out how we can search for API documents and also read them, which is a small, really quick demo that I want to show you. Because if you go to the browser and maybe I want to check the GitHub API. If you know the service name, you can always search for GitHub and then API. Usually you will get some URL developer.github.com or sometimes api.github.com. It depends on the service. And you can see the overview here. And this is the documents of the API. This is not the API itself. You usually get to the documentation. And this part is very important because you can actually read here how to use the GitHub API. You can see a lot of information about the date format, as you can see here. You can see some other requests, some detailed representations. You can read about authentication, so how do you log in? We'll cover that as well. How do you even use GitHub API with your own credentials? And yeah, you can have, this is general explanation about how to use the GitHub. It uses HTTP, which we'll cover in the next video. So you can also see the redirects, what kind of verbs is it using, and pagination, so you can maybe get not all of the repositories, maybe you can get maybe 100 per page, and a lot of information. Usually in APIs, you have here on the right side a lot of different actions that you can do. For example, if I go to repositories in GitHub, I can also check here all the actions that I can do with repositories. So you can see here list of repositories for authenticated user. So I can get list of repositories, and it also shows you the parameters. It's very important to see. You can really read here what it expects to receive. So this is a string. It can also tell you if it's optional or mandatory. And also there are sometimes, there you go, a response format. So this is example of what would you expect to receive when you ask for, here in this example is repositories for an organization. This is what you would expect to receive. This format, by the way, called JSON. I'll explain about this format in the next video. It's a very popular format that most APIs use. And yeah, so you can really scroll down here and check all the options that you can do with repositories. You can create a repository using this API. You can probably get all the users, and you have a lot of docs in this API. Let's check another one. Let's assume that I want to find an API that gives me the weather data, because maybe I want to build a weather application and I want to provide users with the current weather information. But unfortunately, I don't own any weather stations and I'm not a meteorologist, so I have no idea how to get and predict the weather. So luckily, I do have weather APIs. You can type weather API and you can see a bunch of results. The first one is actually a very popular one. It's called Open Weather API. I use it a few times. It's very nice and easy to use. And here again, you have documentation, you have guide, and as you can see, pricing. So maybe it's not totally free API, although you can use it free for some amount of time. For personal use, it's probably no problem. But if you want to have a big application, you probably have to pay them for the weather information. Here you can see maybe API docs is a good place to start when you want to investigate an API. You can check the API docs, and once again, you have examples. You have here the api.openweathermap.org, so you have the full URL here, and you can see that this is how you search for your weather. And here goes something very important. As you can see, so you can search for city name. There's the first parameter, and the second parameter is the API key. So what is an API key? An API key is some sort of credentials. when you want to use an API, especially if it's a paid API, how do they know if the user pay or didn't pay for this service? It's just an URL. They usually give you a key, which is something like a password, and using that key, you can actually have a request, and they'll recognize the key that it is you, and they'll give you maybe the correct information. Maybe they'll charge you money according to the requests. So the API key is something that you'll see in the future. It's some sort of credentials, and when you use or have API key, you must keep it a secret, just like a password. So don't post it in GitHub or Facebook or other places as well. So for the Open Weather API, we do have a bunch of examples here. You can get by CTID, or you can get by geographical credentials the weather. Maybe if I can click here, there you go. So I see again, this format is a JSON format. Maybe it's a little bit weird or hard to read from here. However, it makes sense to return something in this format because it's very easy to use this JSON format from JavaScript, which we'll see next in the next videos. And yeah, I can see the weather here, probably temperature here. I think it's in Kelvin, so it's not that hot in London, don't worry. Yeah, clouds, and this one looks like a public and available API, which is nice and easy to use. And again, you can read the documentation. It usually tells you everything, like how do you authenticate, how do you get the API key, how do you do request, what should you receive, what kind of error messages do you have. Let's go back to the slides. One cool link that I saw someone posted a while ago is a list of really nice public APIs. Yeah, so this is some GitHub repository that some guy or maybe a few people just added a huge list of public APIs that you can use. So all of those are public. Some of those probably are free, some of those probably are not free, but you can see a lot of categories here. So you can get, let's see, health. So you can get a lot of information about health or jobs or machine learning, music APIs, just like Spotify. So you can see how many different kind of services you can use. You can get news. You can also some other data that you can find online. And most of the big companies have their own APIs, so you can use or write an application that interacts with that company and receive and get some information from that. Yeah, so Flickr API, you can search for photos. I can send you the link later. You can just check it later. There's a lot of APIs, and when you go to any API, you can just, of course, see the documentations. The documentations are they're different for every API, as you saw, and it happens. Some documentations are better than others. Yeah, so this one is really cool. You can check a lot of public APIs that you can interact with. Yeah. So how do you use the API? We saw some examples of APIs. We saw some maybe cool documentations. How do we use it? So first you can just use a live example. Like I clicked on the weather app. I just clicked the link and boom, it showed me the big JSON response. Some website has it. Sometimes there's like try me button that you can actually interact with the API on the website just to test it, to see if it fits, to see if you like the response that it gives you. It's nice. There's some other tools. One really popular tool called Postman. It's very nice and very cool to use. You can just create an API calls and make API calls with this tool as well. And also you can just write your own program with JavaScript. And this is exactly what we're going to do in the next videos. And you're going to do in this whole module. You'll write JavaScript that just interacts with some APIs, displays information from the internet on your JavaScript page. So this was the summary of APIs. We learned here in this video what is an API, why do we need this, and what API defines. We also saw some examples of APIs. We saw documentation of GitHub and OpenWeatherMap. We also search for an API to see how do we search for an API. We understand the differences between the public and private APIs. And we also discussed a little bit here in this slide how can we actually use an API. This concludes this video of APIs. APIs is a really broad topic and it's used everywhere in the programming language. And if you don't get it 100%, that's fine. You'll get it much better when you actually use one. Yeah. And that's it. So thank you for watching and see you next time.